Voila.
So open dialogue is a concept or a treatment system that Tyler and I felt like we didn't really know much about. Like people had talked about it in the cohort and kind of around in Burlington and Vermont, but I don't think that there's it's talked about with a lot of opacity. You know, a lot of it's pretty not clear. At least it was never clear to me.
And so this is our attempt to clear things up for ourselves and anyone else that is interested.
So open dialogue is a philosophical approach to therapy. It has some roots in some interesting philosophy that we'll talk about later, but it's really for people in acute crisis, people with psychosis particularly, and it also draws their social networks around them.
True that. And I'll set up the video for you. This is a Finnish psychologist, Jaakko Seikkula, I think. And he is going to describe what he sees as some of the things that open dialogue is trying to accomplish and some of the things that it is not doing. Um, all right.
Det att kan öppen dialog icke är. Jag har hört från Bjarne att till och med nyligen i danska aviser man har skrivit upp att öppen dialog är antipsykiatri. Öppen dialog är icke antipsykiatri. Det är en tanke att vara inne i psykiatrin väldigt kraftigt. Och öppen dialog är icke någon kan vi blev kritiserat i Norge av några professorer som sa att det där är förbigående bölge som många andra bölger om schizofrenin sen men det är icke en som förbigående bölge som stannar upp av en kortvarande entusiasm. Öppen dialog är icke behandlingsmetod i sig. Och att öppen dialog är icke några speciella regler som du måste följa för att ha en god praxis. Och också till sist, öppen dialog är icke någon mainstream inne i psykiatrin eller dementa hälsoarbete. Vad är öppen dialog? Det är ett sätt att organisera psykiatrisk behandling. Förstår du, ordet psykiatrisk är lite laddat, så helst skulle snacka om mental hälsa än psykiatri, men när vi snackar om psykiatrin, vi alla vet vad vi hänvisar.
So I think it's really interesting. Jaakko says some things that sound kind of cheap. He says open dialogue is not a passing wave, and he also says that it's not yet mainstream. And I think what he's referring to is really drawn out by the juxtaposition of what he says. I'm talking about mental health and not psychiatry. What he's indicating, I think, is that that open dialogue is a counseling type intervention, or we can look at it that way. It's based around empowerment and equity, and the idea that I don't know that people need to be treated in a humanistic manner.
Yes. Jaakko is trying to describe a more of an approach to how to integrate a client back into their support network as a form of therapy in itself, and how this approach can be applied from place to place. It does not have to be applied one way.
So one of the most fascinating things I think about open dialogue is that it's not a form of treatment. And what does that mean? So it means that psychodynamic theory and feminist theory and CBT, they all have a structured way in which we provide clients with insights, with positive skills. But in fact, open dialogue allows those therapists to work in the systems that they know so well. It allows them to keep their theoretical orientations, but it organizes treatment so that it's not about the structured provision of services. It's about gathering of resources, I suppose.
And those resources could be, like David was just suggesting, actual treatment strategies like CBT or psychodynamic or a psychiatric medication model potentially. But there's a focus here on community and valuing the perspectives of each member of a client support network, including the client.
I think one of the big things about open dialogue is that it was basically like a comprehensive way of reorganizing hospitalization and acute crises for people with psychosis, and basically it was a local system in Western Lapland and Finland. They changed the way that people were admitted into hospitals, and they also did a lot of other interesting things like around that don't often get talked about, that we'll talk about later. But there is then this question of adaptability for open dialogue.
So that is to say that there's some question of how it can be implemented in the United States. Is that what you're thinking of, David?
Yeah, I guess so. Like the idea in Lapland, like they worked with their local employment office, and they kind of like had a way to help these people retain their jobs. And I don't know. And in the U.S., just the idea, and we'll talk about this later, but that insurance systems are very different, and also that there's also like I think a more emphasis on individualistic type treatments and interventions.
Yeah. That definitely makes sense to me. So we're gonna listen to a social U.S. social worker, Dr. Mary Olson, describe what she sees as some of the brilliance of the open dialogue model.
That offering this meeting to talk about therapy was in itself very therapeutic and helpful. So part of the sort of Finnish genius, I think, is this idea of this no therapy. In other words, the treatment meeting was a meeting where they had the person at the center of concern, any family members who were involved in the crisis, anyone else who might be connected to the crisis, anyone else the person wanted to be there, plus all the professionals that were attached to the situation.
So it's really a social network. It's not looking specifically at the family, but all the different meaningful relationships that the person is in their life.
Exactly. And they abandoned this notion really of the system that needed to be corrected. And they focused much more on the immediate crisis and the event of this treatment meeting. And the goal of the treatment meeting was to try to develop some common understanding of the problem. And by doing that, professionals needed to use ordinary language. They couldn't use all this mystified labeling language. And the idea was that everyone in the meeting has a voice. Everyone is an equal partner in trying to resolve or find a constructive response to what's going on. So as a result of this meeting, there was less professional hierarchy. There wasn't the professional jargon, which can lead to objectifying the person in the family. So the Finns began to see that this meeting about what do we do next, without actually thinking of it as therapy, was in and of itself extremely therapeutic, because it was so non-pathologizing and equalizing, and everybody had a voice.
So there's a really kind of common sense element to this, which is if someone's in trouble, you just gather everybody around that person who's connected with them, with some helpers who have some experience with these kinds of issues and these kinds of problems, and then you just have an open discussion where everybody is free to talk and to express themselves. No one is on a higher level than anyone else, and different ways of communicating are respected, because I think what's important about the open dialogue approach is that the person who's in madness or an extreme crisis, even if they are talking or not talking or expressing themselves in a way that would be seen as weird or different or crazy, they're still an equal participant and they're still listened to. Is that right?
Exactly, and I think some of what we see that really is so detrimental to people is not only are they in an extreme crisis, but then we place them at the bottom of a social hierarchy where we don't listen to them.
So they get talked about when they're not there, and they get talked about in a really special way. They get talked down to, they're labeled, and what the person has to say about their own experience is not really welcomed as part of the discussion.
Exactly, and
all right, so here we have a slide connecting sort of the goals and the model of open dialogue with some of the common factors that were identified in the Heart and Soul of Change.
Yeah, so if you look at the different chapters in the Heart and Soul of Change, and Tyler was really essential in turning me on to this idea. But when we revisited the book, it's clear that the basic elements that are comprising open dialogue are really, really reflected in the rigorous and kind of like broad body of research in the field. I'll just run through it really quickly, but the therapeutic relationship, absolutely essential, and that means avoiding pejorative comments. That means empowering the client and fostering relationality. And then the Anderson chapter was about healing setting and ritual, and there's a ritualistic gathering here, which is really essential.
And the Sparks chapter also discussed that antipsychotics may not be necessary, and there's a lot of research to support that they may actually negatively correlate with positive outcomes. And again, open dialogue, while not against the use of antipsychotics per se, is also a potential alternative to the use of medication.
Yeah, and then the last chapter by Lambert and Miller, and the authors of the book, is just about openness to it includes openness to outcome data again, which is like the session rating scale, outcome rating scale. But the openness to the client's words and experiences through multiple lenses is just the whole approach. I mean, that's really what open dialogue is all about. So we thought certain things would be important to highlight here. So one of the things is like the idea of transparency and congruence. And last semester when we read in Erin's class, Psychoanalytic Diagnosis, Nancy McWilliams she's really clear in saying that people who have like symptoms of borderline personality disorder or psychotic type states, that they need more genuineness, they need more directness in working with them. Like there's a heightened sensitivity and kind of like there's some of the basic trust things that come up that are really kind of primal and essential to their treatment.
Yeah, and then the dialogic format of that is in the namesake comes from the literary theory actually of Mikhail Bakhtin, a Russian theorist who was repressed by Stalin, perhaps not surprisingly, and developed the idea of polyphony being in the novels of Dostoevsky. Polyphony meaning many voices. So as in the format of the open dialogue sessions, all the voices are valued. All the voices of the support network, the family, and the client in a non-hierarchical way, i.e., without rank.
Yeah, and then just quickly, Gregory Bateson in the 1950s wrote a philosophy of schizophrenia, and he just said that there's this. He referred to this thing called the double bind, which is about people in psychosis experiencing like very competing and like essential like value conflicts, and kind of how this like puts them in a state where they can't function as well. And Jaakko Seikkula is like really key. He really draws this out as that like this psychotic crisis. Like people need to hear the high levels of expressed emotion, and they need to have folks in their lives' voices drawn out for understanding and for healing. And this is really a big part of the open dialogue system.
So some of the techniques and interventions have already been addressed, but the first, the need to provide immediate help for the client, and in a treatment meeting format where everyone can come together with two or more therapists to help facilitate a dialogue about what's going on, what may be able to help, and value each participant in the conversation. The participation of the family and other members of the support network, which can include friends, other treatment providers, medical or mental health related, professional, someone from someone's workplace, etc.
Yeah, and just in the interest of time, the rest of the things are really just essential to the counseling field. Open-ended questions, ordinary language and not jargon, transparency, just I don't know, just a fundamental openness to the client and a fundamental bridging the divide that can be created by our traditional modes of working with clients, which I think for counseling is, in our opinion, essential. So a lot of the research done on open dialogue has been naturalistic observation research, and we've talked about that in Gehrig and other things. So, but it basically means that the as well as they can do the research, as rigorously as they can do it, and they've done, Sekula and other psychologists and counselors and psychiatrists have done research in Western Lapland and around open dialogue's implementation. But there's no causation that we're able to pull out here. They're dense. There's a lot of variables, and I think, there's also this kind of like, there's the whole set of other factors that can be influencing outcomes, like, historical, especially looking at historical control groups, like what was happening geopolitically and socially at the time. I mean, these are huge question marks left around open dialogue, but there is like a body of research that has been started,
and there's more that could be done. So I suppose the moving forward, just any efforts that may be able to connect open dialogue to the common factor research that was identified in much of our reading can only help strengthen the suggestions that open dialogue is bringing forward for how we can change our mental health system.
and I think this is one of the big things that I think open dialogue, there's a lot of evidence for this, but one of the people at the UK Open Dialogue conference, Dr. Peter Kinderman, a psychologist, said it would take a lot of evidence to convince me that referring to open dialogue is not true, because it's like, the studies have shown that outcomes haven't worsened for people experiencing psychotic crisis in the Western Lapland area, but beyond that, just the mobilization of basic empowerment initiatives for the client, and just basic attentiveness and speed of care, and kind of just making sure that people are protected. There's a prohibition around abuse in open dialogue, so emotional and physical and verbal and other abuse would be talked about, and then therapy would be readjusted. But gathering people's social networks, because that's we all know from our personal lives that social networks and community are essential to healing.
And moving away from some of the alienating effects of the loss of agency that the traditional medical model sometimes creates, and reintegrating clients into their support networks and communities.
Yeah. So the number of really, I think this is it. When we talked about it, it's a fun system for Tyler and I to research, because it's super philosophical, but the questions are huge. Like the WHO has done a study of over 13,000 individuals experiencing psychotic symptoms, and just like the idea that outcomes are better in developing countries, and I'm looking at what that means about the West and individuality and distrust in community, and what comprises healing. It's a very different mode of looking at counseling type interventions than just like a randomized control trial, or just like manipulating one or maybe multiple variables, depending on how good you think the research tends to be.
Well, we're getting really close to time here, so I suppose the last thing that I'll just offer is that I think there's a lot to be said about the idea that suffering is stigmatized in the West, and the extent to which that ends up becoming an individual concern. So, as was discussed the other day in Lance's class, by moving away from a system that positions the individual as responsible for their situation and helps broaden the social field, so that this is something that can be embraced collectively, and that by doing so, that can contribute to healing.
So that's it. And there's more research that we read around applications for this in the US and all, but that's the end of our presentation. We're happy to answer questions and talk more about it. And I hope I can figure out how to shut this off. If not, forgive me. And there will just be a little bit of time at the end of the video where it just kind of rolls out as we work out the technology. But consider this the end point for the 20 minutes.
Ciao and thanks.
Thanks.